Pax vobiscum. Welcome back to the channel, and to another reading of Miyamoto Musashi's book, The Five Rings. Today we are going to continue our reading with the Scroll of Wind. In strategy, it is important to understand the ways of other styles. Therefore, I write about these various other styles on the Scroll of Wind, and record these things in this scroll. If you do not know the ways of other styles, it is certainly difficult to understand the way of our style and how it is different. Exploring other schools of strategy, we see that there are some styles that use extremely large swords and emphasize physical strength to carry out their techniques. Conversely, there are those styles that call themselves short sword, kodachi, schools, and use very small swords to train in their way. Then there are other styles that contrive myriad techniques and positions of the sword, calling some of them outer, omote, and others inner, oku, and which teach their ways like this. None of these is the true way. In this scroll I will write all this out clearly, explaining the good and the bad, that which follows natural principles and that which diverges from them. The way and principles of my style are something totally different. These other styles embellish and elaborate the fighting arts, rendering them flowery solely with the intention of making a living. Because they are fabrications made up to be sold, how can they possibly be the true way? What is more, most people see strategy from a narrow perspective, thinking of it only as swordsmanship, just learning to swing a sword, to move their bodies effectively or concentrating on how to control their hands. Have they truly understood how to achieve victory? Of all of these, none is the way without any certainty. The other style's shortcomings I will record in these writings. Investigating deeply, you should understand the advantages of the Nito Ichiryu, 2 swords, 1 style. Carrying a very long sword in other styles. There are other styles than ours which have a preference for a very long sword. From the perspective of my style of strategy, I view this as a weak style. The reason for this is that these other styles of strategy, as they do not understand the principles that will allow them to beat a person no matter what the conditions are, think of the length of the sword as a virtue, and that it will allow them to beat an enemy from a distance. This must be the essence of why they prefer a very long sword. Many people say 1 son of reach counts, but this is the talk of those who do not understand strategy. Accordingly, because they do not grasp the principles of strategy, they take something long and try to win from far away. This is evidence of a weakness of heart, and thus should be viewed as weak strategy. If the enemy is in close, that is, near enough to grapple with, then the longer your sword is, the harder it is to strike with it. The sword becomes useless or even gets in the way, and you are worse off than someone with only a short sword, or even someone unarmed. As for people who prefer a very long sword, there are various explanations, but all of those are just people's individual rationales. When viewed from the perspective of the true way, out in the real world, there is no reason for this preference. Not carrying a long sword at all, will someone with a short sword definitely lose? Also, in situations where one is blocked off above, below at the sides or some such, or when seated and one can only wear the wakizashi, a strong preference for the long sword in such cases strategically is questionable, and thus a bad idea. Some people are physically weaker, and for those who are so, sticking a long katana through their belt just does not work. Since long ago it has been said that the large will answer to the small, but this does not mean to thoughtlessly avoid the long. It means you should avoid a feeling of dependency on the long. In large-scale strategy, the very long sword is a large number of people. The short is a small number of people. A small number of people and a large one. Do they not meet in combat? To win with a small number of troops. This, in fact, is the virtue of strategy. In the past as well, there are many examples where a small force took the victory from a large one. In our style, These kinds of biased and narrow-minded ideas above are something to be avoided. You need to study this carefully. Regarding other styles' use of the forceful sword. In swords, there should not be anything you call a strong sword or a weak sword. Trying to swing the sword hand is a bad thing. Winning with such rough techniques is difficult. Also, when you go to cut a person down, if you try to cut excessively strongly, calling it a forceful sword, you will not be able to cut at all. Even when you just intend to cut test objects and the like, if you try to cut forcefully, it is bad. No matter who it is, no one, when he comes to sword blows with an enemy, thinks to cut weakly or to cut strongly. When you think about cutting a person down and killing him, you do not intend to cut strongly, and of course you do not intend to cut weakly. The only thing you think is enough for the enemy to die. Also, with a forceful sword, if you try to knock the other person's sword aside excessively strongly, you will overextend yourself, and this is always bad. If you hit someone else's sword very forcefully, it can happen that your own sword breaks apart as well. For these reasons, things that is called a forceful sword and such do not exist in our style. In large-scale strategy as well, even when you have a strong number of troops, if you intend to win through sheer force when you engage in battle, the enemy also has strong troops and intends to fight hard as well. This is the same thing for both of you. As for winning, in all things if you abandon the principles of the way, you will not win. In our way, we do not think of forcing anything even a little, having the wisdom of strategy. The heart of it is to understand how to win in any way at all. You should work through this carefully. The use of a much shorter sword in other styles. To think of winning by using very short swords exclusively is not the true way. Since long ago, the uses of both the long and the short swords have been clearly explained, calling them the tachi and katana. In the world, there are people of great strength who can wield a very large sword as if it were quite light, so forcing oneself to prefer something short makes no sense, because these people can use long swords, as well as carry spears and naginata. Taking a short sword and trying to cut a person in the intervals between his swing of the long sword, or trying to jump in, trying to grab him, and so forth, to rely on ideas like these is bad. Furthermore, looking for openings to attack is essentially to be seen as being on the defensive against everything. It has the feeling of becoming entangled, and is something to be avoided. If, using something small, you try to get in on your opponent and grapple with him or disarm him, when you are among many opponents, this idea is not useful. One who has become specialized in the use of the short weapons thinks to parry the cuts of many attackers, freely jump about and spin around, but all of these actions become what is called the receiving sword, and have a feeling of being rushed. They are not a decisive way to do things. In this kind of situation, it is better to make your body straight and strong, chase people around, make them jump away, and attack them in such a way that it drives them into a state of confusion. This is a way to assure certain victory. In large-scale strategy, the same principle applies. In a similar situation, gather your forces, intending to press the enemy, driving into them fiercely and immediately crush them. This is a key idea of strategy. Most people, when learning to do these things, learn to parry, dodge, escape, duck, and so forth. Their minds become distracted by this way of doing things, and they are easily manipulated by other people. The way of strategy is straight and true. Thus, having the correct principles, to drive people around and to cause them to do as you want is vital. You must study this deeply. Very numerous sword techniques and other styles. Devising a great number of sword techniques and teaching them to people is just a technique for turning the way into a commodity and selling it to them, with the intention of making beginners think that when they have learned a great number of techniques, they have understood deeply. This way of thinking about strategy is to be avoided. The reason for this is that when you think about all the various ways there are to cut a person down, you can get the feeling of becoming lost. In fact, when it comes to cutting a person down, there is no special way to do it. Whether the person is knowledgeable of swordsmanship or ignorant, or even if you are a woman or child, striking, chopping, slicing, there are not so many ways to do these things. As for anything different, you can talk about stabbing or reaping, but other than those, there is nothing else. The way to do it is just to cut first, so there is no reason to have numerous detailed techniques. However, depending on the place and conditions, it may happen that there are times when you are blocked in at the top, from the side, or the like. Since it is true that you may not be able to hold your sword in a certain way, we have 5 forms, one for each of these 5 orientations. Adding other than these, corkscrewing the hands, twisting the body, jumping, dodging, as a ways of cutting a person down is not the true way. When cutting a person down, if you corkscrew your hands, you cannot cut. If you twist your body, you cannot cut. If you jump, you cannot cut. If you dodge, you cannot cut. None of these things is of any use at all. In my style of strategy, you make your posture and your spirit straight. It is your adversary you make warp and bend, and you take victory by making your opponent's spirit twist and turn. This is vital. You should investigate this diligently. Other styles' use of special sword positions. Emphasizing special positions of the sword is a mistake. The only time in the world where there would ever be positions is when there is not actually an adversary in front of you. These specifics are like taking general customs from long ago, making them the rules of today, and codifying them into laws. This has no place in the way of single combat. Rather, you must think of putting your opponent in a bad situation. In all things, taking a position means trying to make use of immobility. Whether it is taking up a position in a castle, or whether it is making formations within the ranks and such like, the intent is to be strongly unmoving even when attacked by someone. This is the usual meaning. As for the way of strategy in single combat, in all things you must be constantly intent on taking the initiative, always taking the initiative. The idea of taking up a position means waiting for someone else to take the initiative. You should work this out thoroughly. The way of strategy in single combat lies in causing other people to move their positions, doing things the opponent has not imagined, or confounding the enemy, or upsetting him, or menacing him, and grasping the rhythm of when the adversary has become confused. In order to win, you must avoid defensive ideas like taking a position. It is because of all this that in our way we say position, no position, by which it is meant that even though we may happen to arrive in a certain position, we are not taking up that position. In large-scale strategy as well, understand the number of the enemy's forces, perceive the nature of the battlefield, know the condition of your own numbers, grasp their virtues, assemble your people and begin the battle. These are the essentials of engaging in combat. From having someone else take the initiative against you, to when you take the initiative yourself, there is a twofold change in your advantage. Thinking to position your sword well and parry or deflect the adversary's sword skillfully is the same as taking spears and naginata and making a fence out of them, and then, when striking the enemy, pulling up the fence posts and using them again as spears and naginata. You should consider this deeply. Setting the gaze and other styles. Among certain styles of swordsmanship and strategy, when they speak of setting the gaze, there are those that fix the gaze on the opponent's sword, and styles that fix the gaze at the hands. There are also those that fix the gaze on the face, or set the gaze on the feet, and so on. Separating things into parts and trying to fix the gaze on them is like a distraction to the mind, and is to be regarded as a blight on strategy. An example of this is players of Kimari, who despite not looking closely at the ball can kick Benzuri. Even rolling off omimari or spin kicking, they are accustomed to kicking, so there is no need to look closely with the eyes. Or, for example, the techniques of people who do aerobatics and so forth. When they have become used to their ways, even when perching doors on the tips of their noses, juggling any number of swords and such, none of them sets their gaze fixedly on anything. But since they are accustomed to do what they are doing, they see naturally. In the way of strategy as well, when you are accustomed to facing opponents, you will be able to see the lightness or heaviness of their minds. When you have practiced and grasped the way, you will be able to see the distance and speed of any sword. The gaze in strategy, broadly, is an eye that rests upon the other person's mind. And strategy on the large scale as well. It is the eye that rests upon the condition of the enemy's forces. There are two ways of viewing, perceiving and looking. Make the perceiving eye strong. See that particular opponent's mind, and see the conditions of that place. Setting the gaze broadly, see the circumstances of the battle. See the changes of power in that particular moment, and secure certain victory. That is the essence. In either large-scale strategy or small, there is no fixing the gaze minutely. As I have written before, if you can set your view closely on particulars, you forget about large things. The feeling arises of your view becoming lost, and certain victory slips away from you. Carefully investigate these principles, and train in them. The use of feet in other styles. The ways of stepping with the feet in other styles include those that are called floating feet, flying feet, bouncing feet, creeping feet, and crow feet. These are various specialized manners of treading. All of them viewed from the perspective of my strategy are to be considered lacking. As for avoiding floating feet, the reason for this is that when it comes to battle, your feet will always want to float, and thus the way to do it is to be sure to tread as firmly as possible. Next, you should not develop a liking for flying feet. In flying feet, when you jump, there is a beginning. In flying feet, when you jump, there is a beginning, and when you land, there is a feeling of fixedness. There cannot be said to be any advantage to jumping around again and again, so flying feet are bad. Then there are bouncing feet. With the feeling of bouncing, you will not be able to advance. As for creeping feet, they are waiting feet, and as such they are something in particular to be avoided. Besides these, there are crow feet, various kinds of quick-stepping and so forth. When you are in a swamp or on a moor, or else when you are on a mountain, in a river, in a stony field, or on a narrow path, and you cross swords with an opponent, there are situations where you cannot jump around and cannot step quickly. In our strategy, nothing is changed about the feet. It is just like walking down the street as usual. You should move in accordance with the opponent's rhythm. When moving quickly, maintaining the same demeanor and posture as when you move slowly, not moving too little or too much, and without disorder in your steps. In large-scale strategy, the carrying of the feet is crucial. The reason for this is that if, not knowing the enemy's intent, you recklessly attack quickly, and you go against the natural rhythm of the battle, and it is difficult to win. Conversely, if you tread too slowly, you may miss seeing a point when the enemy wavers and begins to collapse, and let a chance for victory slip away, and so you cannot finish the battle quickly. When you discern a moment of disruption and collapse, it is essential to take the victory without allowing the enemy to have even the slightest pause to recoup. You should train and practice this thoroughly. The use of speed in other schools of strategy. A strategy of being fast is not the true way. What is called being fast is, in all things, not being coordinated with the intervals of their rhythm. Thus things are said to be fast or slow. When you become skilled in this way, you do not appear to be fast. For example, there are people called express couriers who can cover 40 or 50 ri in a day. They do not run fast from morning to night either. Unseasoned runners, even if they run all day long, do not make much progress. In the way of no drama, when a good singer chants a piece, if a less skilled performer chants along with him, there is a feeling that he is falling behind and rushing to catch up. Or when beating the drum for the old pine, although it has a slow tempo, an unskilled drummer similarly will lag behind and try to jump ahead. As for high sands, it has a quick pace, but it is bad to play it fast. He who hurries falls, as they say, and winds up late. Of course, being too slow is also bad. When skilled people do something, they may appear to move quite slowly, but they never miss a beat. In anything, when trained people do it, they never appear to be rushed. Taking these examples, you should understand the principles of the way. Especially in the way of strategy, trying to go fast is bad. The reason for this, too, is that depending on the place, such as in swamps or moors, it is difficult to move quickly, for both the feet and the body. As for the sword, cutting quickly is bad. If you try to cut fast, since it is not like a fan or a knife, cutting with it quickly you will not be able to cut even a little. You must learn to discern this well. And large-scale strategy as well. The feeling of rushing quickly is bad. If you keep the intention of holding the pillow down, you will never even be a little slow. Furthermore, in situations where a person is being excessively fast, it is essential for you to go contrary. Become slow and calm and do not be drawn in. The spirit of this is something you must work out, train, and practice. Deep and surface teaching of other styles. Regarding the points of strategy, which should be called surface and which should be called deep. In the arts, each of them has what are things called like secret teachings of deeper meaning, or deep teachings and entrance teachings. But in the principles for times when you must enter into combat with an opponent, it is not like you go into battle with surface teachings and cut someone down using deep. As for how to teach my strategy, with people who are just beginning to learn the way, first have them practice those techniques that are easy to get used to, and teach them those principles that are quickly appreciated. For things that are difficult to understand, you should discern the points at which the person's mind frees up, and gradually teach the deeper principles. However, in general, since you are getting them to learn things that depend on the situation, there aren't many such things as deep or entrance teachings. You know, out in the world, if you go walking deep in the mountains, if you think to go as deep as possible into them, eventually, instead, you come out to an entrance. In the way of any given thing, there are situations where deep teachings are applicable, and cases in which using entrance principles are more appropriate. In this way of battle, though, what is to be hidden and what is to be revealed, there is no difference between deep and surface teachings. For this reason, in transmitting our way, I have no liking for things such as oaths of secrecy. Assess the intelligence of those people who learn this way, and teach them the correct way, which will cause them to leave behind the bad points of the 5 ways or 6 ways found in strategy. Then, naturally, they will enter the true way of the warrior's practice, and develop a heart free of doubt. This is how to teach my strategy. Above, I have set out 9 articles regarding the other schools of strategy, and written them down in this scroll of wind. I probably should have written about them specifically, one by one, each school from entrance to deep teachings, but I deliberately have not said what was important for each style or indicated them by name. The reason for this is that even if I individually pointed out each style and had my say on each of their ways, each person, following his own mind, has his own individual way of thinking. Even within the same style, the ideas change little by little. Then later I would continually have had to write periodic updates for each style. The general ideas of the other styles I have divided into these 9 sections. If you look around at the techniques of the people in the world at large, some are biased towards long weapons. Some say shorter are advantageous. Some are biased towards using strong or rough or precise techniques. All of these are prejudiced ways of doing things, And so without going into everything from the entrance to the deep teachings of the other styles, everyone should understand what I am talking about. In my style, the sword has neither depths nor entrance. There is no ultimate position. Only taking your mind and perfecting its virtues. This is the essence of strategy. And so there we have our reading of Miyamoto Musashi's book, the fourth book, or scroll as he calls them, the Scroll of Wind. And I find this particular scroll interesting because he actually goes into depth and discusses his strategy versus many of the other strategies of the day, things that he had seen. And sort of the prevailing theme that I sort of picked up from all of this is this sort of concept of, I think, rigidity versus flexibility. And what I mean by that is he discusses these other styles and how they go into sort of, corkscrew hands, jumping, leaping feet. Here's all these different sorts of positions and sword strikes and sort of other rules and stuff that you had to follow in order to claim to be a part of that school of swordsmanship or way or what have you. Versus Miyamoto Musashi's, what he's talking about with his way is very flexible, is very open. There's not a lot of very specific things. And in fact, he says even his positions, called position, no position, the very intent of those is simply that more often than not, you will find yourself having to defend or orient yourself to those different sorts of positions. And so he just generally laid them out so that you're aware of sort of like the normal flow of battle a bit, so you understand that you could end up in these particular positions, and in general, depending on the situation, here are some ways to respond to that. And that is another thing too. He very much says over and over again, stressing the importance of practice, and states often as well, depending on the situation, which I actually agree with his way of looking at things, I guess you could say. The idea of being flexible in mind and body, being flexible in thought form, and in the idea of strategy is not to be at a, to sort of use these terms of tactical and strategy at the tactical level, meaning more down to yourself, a sort of more focused, honed in view, versus I can't speak, excuse me, versus the strategic view, which is more broad, outstretched. Your mind is open. You are reading the situation, the energy, the body language of your opponent versus staring tactically at their sword or their feet. And you're also thinking outside of yourself. And what I mean by that is, instead of focusing on, this happened, therefore I will respond with this movement, you're much more fluid. You're looking at things as a whole. And just in general, this concept of open mind, open body, it depends on the situation. Read the situation and your opponent and respond in kind. But again, he stresses this once more. The whole point of the swordsmanship, the whole point of anything is to win, is to crush your enemy and to win by any means possible. That's what makes it the way of swordsmanship, the art and way of the warrior, whose purpose is to defeat opponents, and separates it from, he compares it to different forms of art such as no dancing or sword playing. Oh, excuse me, not sword playing, drum playing. He says he separates the two, because when you have these different art forms, you can afford, like you're focused on an art, you can be more flowery. There's not an intent to win. There's not an intent to cut down your opponent as swiftly as possible and with by any means possible, versus the way of the warrior, the way of swordsmanship. That is the whole point. And we sort of saw that in the Scroll of Fire as well, with Musashi stressing that the whole point of being a warrior is to cut down your opponent. So I think I rambled a little bit, sorry about that, but that is sort of my takeaway from this chapter, this scroll in particular, is when you actually see his way compared to the other ways, you do get an understanding for what he's talking about, and I can actually see how his way would be better, or a thought, a way of thinking to be better. And in reading some of the things that he's been saying, I think I see some of that similar thinking in my own mind. I've always tended to look at the world with more of an open mind and thinking, you know, what can I learn from this to apply here? How can I reach my goal in an efficient manner? And it's hard to put into words, really, but I'm really resonating with Miyamoto Musashi. And I think that's why his book holds such power and is considered a classic of strategy and of, for lack of a better term, self-help even today, is because even though he's talking about something that feels very specific, such as the way of the samurai warrior and swordsmanship, and it was written in the, I believe, late 1600s, early 1700s, in sort of the tail end of feudal Japan, we can relate to Miyamoto Musashi. We can relate to the things that he's talking about. And even though he's talking about swordsmanship, what he's really describing is a way of thinking. And just to keep the rambling going, that really resonates with me in the sense of we can relate to the people who've come before us. History is not dead. History is alive in every sense of the word, and we can especially see that here with Miyamoto Musashi and his ability to speak to us and touch our souls and our thoughts, even from centuries and centuries ago. And now I'll stop rambling at all of you now. But that concludes our reading of the Wind Scroll. And next we will read the Scroll of Emptiness. That will be a rather short video. I almost decided to include it with this video, but ultimately I decided I would keep up the theme of separating each scroll into a separate video, and then they will be all together in the playlist, the 5 Rings playlist that I have on my channel here. And so our next video will be Scroll of Emptiness, and then after that there will be part 2 of the book, which goes into a little more detail about some other thoughts that Musashi had. So that's how we'll sort of split everything up. With that being said, thank you for listening and for watching, and I look forward to continuing our discussion of the 5 Rings in our next video. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Pax vobiscum. Goodbye.